1. The Highway Specter. Mike Thompson was a seasoned long-haul trucker. He'd spent over 20 years in navigating the endless highways of America, transporting everything from electronics to livestock, and he thought he'd seen it all. The open road was his home, and the cab of his truck was his sanctuary. But one cold, foggy night in late October would change everything. Mike was on a routine route from Chicago to a small town in Wyoming. He had driven this road many times before, but something felt different tonight. The day had been overcast, and as night fell, a thick fog descended, wrapping the world outside in an impenetrable shroud. Mike flipped on his high beams, but the fog seemed to swallow the light, leaving only a narrow strip of road visible ahead. As he drove, the radio station he'd been listening to turned to static. He tried tuning into another station, but all he could pick up was faint, eerie music, barely audible over the crackling noise. With a sigh, he turned the radio off, letting the silence settle around him like the fog outside. It was just past midnight when Mike first saw her. She appeared suddenly, standing on the side of the road, a solitary figure shrouded in mist. At first, Mike thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Who in their right mind would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this time of night? As he drew closer, he could see her more clearly, a young woman, dressed in a long, white dress, her dark hair hanging in loose waves around her pale face. She was standing still, her thumb extended, a classic hitchhiker's gesture. Mike hesitated. He'd heard all sorts of stories about phantom hitchhikers, ghostly figures that disappeared as soon as they were picked up, or worse, led drivers to their doom. But those were just stories, he told himself. He was a practical man, grounded in the realities of life on the road. Besides, he couldn't just leave her out here alone. He slowed the truck to a stop and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" he called out, his voice sounding oddly loud in the quiet night. The woman didn't move at first, as if she hadn't heard him. Then, slowly, she nodded and approached the truck. There was something strange about the way she moved, almost as if she were gliding rather than walking. Mike unlocked the door, and she climbed in without a word, settling into the seat beside him. She stared straight ahead, her hands resting in her lap, and Mike couldn't help but notice how cold it felt inside the cab, colder than it should have been. "Where you headed?" Mike asked, trying to break the ice. "North," she replied, her voice soft and melodic, yet carrying an unsettling undercurrent. "Anywhere you're going." Mike nodded and pulled back onto the road. He tried to engage her in conversation, asking her name, where she was from, but her answers were vague and brief, as though she were deliberately avoiding giving away too much. As the miles passed, the fog seemed to thicken, wrapping the truck in a cocoon of white. The road ahead was empty, the landscape on either side swallowed by the mist. The silence in the cab was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the asphalt. To pass the time, Mike started telling stories. He had a repertoire of tales collected from years on the road, and he hoped they might draw the woman out of her shell. He told her about the strange lights he'd seen in the sky over New Mexico, the time he had driven through a tornado in Kansas, and the odd characters he'd met at truck stops along the way. She listened in silence, her expression unreadable. But when he mentioned ghost stories, her eyes seemed to flicker with interest. Mike noticed and leaned into it, recounting the most famous tales among truckers: the ghost trucker of Route 666, the haunted rest stop in Arizona, and the phantom hitchhiker who appeared on lonely stretches of highway only to vanish without a trace. "You seem to know a lot about ghosts," she said quietly after he finished one of his stories. Her voice was calm, but there was something in her tone that made the hairs on the back of Mike's neck stand up. "Just stories," Mike said with a shrug, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that was creeping up on him. "They make for good company on lonely nights." "Stories can be true," she replied, turning to look at him for the first time since she had gotten into the truck. Her eyes were dark, almost too dark, and they seemed to bore into him, as if she could see straight through to his soul. Sometimes, the truth is scarier than any fiction. Mike felt a chill run down his spine. "You got any stories of your own?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She nodded slowly, her gaze still locked on his. "I do," she said, her voice taking on a slightly eerie tone. "Would you like to hear one?" Mike wasn't sure he wanted to, but he nodded anyway. "Sure," he said. "Why not?" The woman began her story in a low, almost hypnotic voice. She told him about a man who had picked up a hitchhiker on a night just like this. The hitchhiker was a woman, beautiful and mysterious, who spoke little but had an air of sadness about her. As they drove, the man tried to learn more about her, but she remained elusive, giving him only vague answers. As the night wore on, the man began to notice strange things happening. The temperature in the truck dropped, the air growing colder with each passing mile. The radio, which had been playing soft music, started to emit a low hum, followed by a high-pitched whine, before going silent altogether. The dashboard lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the woman's face. The man grew increasingly uneasy, but he kept driving, afraid to stop in the middle of nowhere. Eventually, the woman spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She told him she was searching for someone who had wronged her, and that she wouldn't rest until she found them. The man tried to press her for more details, but she fell silent again, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. When they finally reached a small town, the man pulled over to let her out. As she stepped out of the truck, she turned to him and smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that sent a jolt of fear through him. "Thank you for the ride," she said. "I found what I was looking for." As she walked away, the man suddenly realized he couldn't remember what she looked like. Her features seemed to blur and fade from his memory, leaving behind only a vague impression of darkness and fear. When he tried to describe her later, all he could recall was the chilling smile and the oppressive cold that had filled the truck after she left. Mike listened, his attention riveted by the story. There was something about the way she told it, the way her voice seemed to weave through the fog like a thread, drawing him deeper into the narrative. When she finished, there was a long silence before Mike spoke. "That's quite a story," he said, his voice betraying the unease he felt. "Did you make that up?" She turned to him, her eyes locking onto his. "No," she said softly. "That story is true." As they continued driving, Mike couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. The woman's story had gotten under his skin in a way that no ghost tale ever had. He kept glancing at her out of the corner of his eye, trying to figure her out, but she remained an enigma. And then, strange things started happening. The temperature inside the cab dropped noticeably, despite the heater being on full blast. Mike felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as the chill seeped into his bones. The radio, which had been silent since the fog rolled in, suddenly crackled to life with a burst of static. Faint, garbled voices filtered through, speaking in a language Mike couldn't understand. He reached over to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge, as if it were frozen in place. The lights on the dashboard flickered, and for a brief moment, Mike thought he saw a shadowy figure reflected in the windshield, a figure that shouldn't have been there. He blinked, and it was gone, but the image remained burned into his mind. "What's going on?" Mike muttered under his breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He tried to focus on the road, but the fog seemed thicker than ever, the white tendrils curling around the truck like ghostly fingers. The woman said nothing, just stared straight ahead with that same blank expression. But Mike could feel her presence beside him, a heavy, oppressive weight that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the woman spoke again. Her voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that made Mike's skin crawl. "Do you know why I'm here?" she asked, turning to look at him with those unsettlingly dark eyes. Mike swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "No," he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why are you here?" She smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just a cold, knowing look that made Mike's heart skip a beat. "I'm here to find someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who has something to answer for." Mike's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he tried to focus on the road, though his mind was racing. "And who might that be?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light, though he could feel the fear creeping into his voice. The woman turned to face him fully, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him shiver. "You," she said simply. A jolt of fear shot through Mike's body, and he forced himself to laugh, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I think you've got the wrong guy," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just a trucker, doing my job. I haven't wronged anyone." Her smile widened, but it only made her look more sinister. "Are you sure about that, Mike?" she asked, her tone laced with an icy chill. "Are you absolutely sure?" Mike felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The way she said his name sent a wave of panic through him. He hadn't told her his name. He was certain of it. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't answer right away, just kept staring at him with those unsettling eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and haunting. "I've been watching you for a long time, Mike. You may not remember me, but I remember you." Mike's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. Who was this woman? What did she want from him? He couldn't remember ever meeting her before, but the way she spoke, with such familiarity, made him question everything. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaking with fear. The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of sadness. "I was someone you knew a long time ago," she said quietly. "Someone you left behind when you took this job, when you decided the road was more important than the people you loved." Mike felt a pang of guilt at her words, though he couldn't place why. He had indeed left people behind in his life, choosing the open road over relationships and stability, but none of them were anything like this woman. "I don't understand," he said, his voice strained. "I don't remember you." She sighed, a sound filled with sorrow and regret. "You will," she said softly. "You will soon enough." The truck rolled on through the thick fog, the silence in the cab growing more oppressive with each passing moment. Mike could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing as he tried to remember who this woman could be. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't place her face, couldn't recall her name. Finally, after what felt like hours, she spoke again. "There was a night, many years ago," she began, her voice low and melodic, drawing him in like a siren's song. "You were driving through the mountains, just like tonight. The fog was thick, the road winding and treacherous. You were tired, but you kept going, determined to make your delivery on time." Mike's breath caught in his throat as she described the scene with such detail, as if she had been there, watching him. He remembered that night. He had been pushing himself to meet a tight deadline, fighting off exhaustion as he navigated the treacherous mountain roads. "There was a turn, a sharp bend in the road," she continued, her voice taking on a more ominous tone. "You didn't see the car until it was too late. It was just there, in your path, and you couldn't stop in time." Mike's blood ran cold as the memory flooded back, vivid and terrifying. The screech of tires, the blare of a horn, the sickening crunch of metal against metal. He had hit the car head-on, sending it careening off the road and down the steep embankment. "I tried to find them," he whispered, his voice choked with guilt. I searched, but the car was gone. I thought. You thought you could forget, she interrupted, her voice cutting through the fog of his memories like a knife. You thought you could leave it behind, keep driving, and never look back. Mike felt tears welling up in his eyes, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. He had tried to forget that night, bury the memory deep in the recesses of his mind. He had told himself it was an accident, that there was nothing he could have done, but deep down, he had always known that wasn't true. The woman reached out, her hand cold as ice as she placed it on his arm. I was in that car, Mike, she said softly, her voice filled with sorrow. I was the one you hit. Mike's heart dropped into his stomach, the full horror of her words sinking in. No, he whispered, shaking his head in denial. No, it can't be. She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a deep, haunting sadness. I died that night, because of you. And I've been searching for you ever since. The fog outside the truck seemed to close in even tighter, the world beyond the windshield disappearing into a swirling void of white. Mike could feel his grip on reality slipping, the line between the living and the dead blurring before his eyes. I'm so sorry, he choked out, tears streaming down his face. I didn't mean to. I didn't want. I know, she said, her voice gentle now, almost forgiving. But you have to face what you've done, Mike. You can't run from it forever. Mike felt a crushing sense of despair as he realized there was no escaping this. He had spent years trying to outrun his guilt, but it had finally caught up with him in the form of this ghostly hitchhiker. What happens now? He asked, his voice trembling with fear. She looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes, and for the first time since she had gotten into the truck, she smiled, a genuine, almost kind smile. Now, you come with me, she said softly. It's time to let go of the road, Mike. It's time to rest. Mike felt a strange sense of peace wash over him at her words, the fear and guilt fading away into a numb acceptance. He knew there was no fighting this, no escaping the fate that had been waiting for him all these years. He let out a shaky breath and nodded. Okay, he whispered. I'm ready. The woman nodded in return, and as she did, the fog outside seemed to lighten, the oppressive darkness lifting to reveal the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. Mike felt the truck slowing, as if it were being guided by some unseen force, and he knew they had reached the end of the line. As the truck came to a stop, the woman leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, her lips cold as ice. Thank you, she whispered, her voice fading into the wind as she stepped out of the cab. Mike watched her walk away, her figure growing more and more translucent until she disappeared entirely into the lightning mist. The world around him seemed to dissolve, the truck, the road, everything fading away into a peaceful, dreamlike state. And then there was nothing but silence. The truck was found the next day, parked neatly on the side of the road with no sign of the driver. The cab was empty, the engine cold, as if it had been sitting there for hours. The authorities searched the area, but there was no trace of Mike Thompson. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The truck was eventually towed away, and the story of the missing trucker became just another mystery, another tale to be whispered among truckers on long, lonely nights. But some say that on foggy nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the hum of a truck engine in the distance, and the faint, haunting voice of a woman telling a story that no one can quite remember. 2. The Vanishing Convoy. On a dark, rain-soaked night in the early 1980s, a convoy of 3 trucks rumbled down the infamous Devil's Pass, a treacherous stretch of road winding through the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. The convoy was tasked with transporting heavy machinery to a mining site deep within the mountains, a job that promised good pay but demanded a steep toll on the nerves of those who dared to undertake it. The convoy leader was Bill "Big Rig" Hansen, a grizzled veteran trucker with over 3 decades of experience on the road. He had seen it all: storms that threatened to blow his rig off the road, mechanical failures in the middle of nowhere, and more than a few close calls with reckless drivers. But nothing had ever shaken him like the stories about Devil's Pass. The road had a reputation that stretched back for generations, known for its hairpin turns, sheer cliffs, and the dense, eerie fog that often enveloped it. Many truckers spoke of strange occurrences on Devil's Pass: unexplained lights, ghostly figures seen in the mist, and worst of all, trucks that went in but never came out the other side. But Bill was not one to put much stock in ghost stories. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let some old wives' tales slow him down. His crew consisted of 2 younger drivers, Jake Rookie Morgan and Sam Speedy Gonzalez, both eager to prove themselves on what they knew was a challenging run. As they started their descent into Devil's Pass, the rain intensified, hammering against the windshields of the trucks and reducing visibility to almost nothing. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog that swirled around them like a living entity, closing in on the convoy with an almost predatory intent. Bill's voice crackled over the CB radio. "Keep it slow and steady, boys. This road's got more twists and turns than a rattlesnake, and the last thing we need is to take a plunge off one of these cliffs." "Roger that, Big Rig," Jake replied, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. It was his first time on Devil's Pass, and though he tried to keep calm, the stories he'd heard were gnawing at the edges of his mind. Sam, always the optimist, chimed in with his usual bravado. "Ain't no road too tough for us, Big Rig. We'll be at that mining site before the sun comes up." Bill didn't respond, his focus entirely on the road ahead. The rain was relentless, turning the narrow mountain road into a slick, dangerous track. The trucks moved in a tight formation, their taillights barely visible to each other through the fog. As they rounded a particularly sharp bend, Bill thought he saw something in the fog, a brief, fleeting image of a figure standing by the side of the road, watching them as they passed. He blinked and shook his head, chalking it up to his imagination playing tricks on him in the poor visibility. But then Jake's voice crackled through the radio again, this time with an edge of fear. "Did you guys see that? There was someone standing there, right on the edge of the road." Sam chuckled, though it sounded forced. "You're just seeing things, Rookie. It's the fog, messing with your eyes." Bill didn't want to admit it, but he had seen it too. He hesitated for a moment before responding. "Keep your eyes on the road, Jake. There's nothing out there but fog and rain." They continued on in tense silence, the only sounds the steady thrum of the engines and the pounding of the rain. But the unease in the cab was palpable, and the drivers couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they reached the midpoint of Devil's Pass, the road narrowed even further, hugging the edge of a steep cliff. On one side was the rocky mountain wall, and on the other, a sheer drop into darkness. The fog was thicker here, almost suffocating, and the headlights seemed to bounce back off the mist, creating an eerie glow around the trucks. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught Bill's eye, and he instinctively slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded on the wet road, coming to a halt just inches from the cliff's edge. Behind him, Jake and Sam managed to stop in time, their tires squealing on the slick pavement. "What the hell, Big Rig?" Sam's voice was laced with irritation, but there was an underlying tension there too. Bill didn't answer right away, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The fog had parted just enough for him to see what had caused him to stop, a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road, facing them with an unnatural stillness. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes that seemed out of place in the modern world. His face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but there was something undeniably off about him, something that sent a chill down Bill's spine. Jake's voice came through the radio, trembling with fear. Who is that? What's he doing out here?" Bill swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But he's blocking the road." They sat there for what felt like an eternity, the rain drumming a relentless rhythm on the roofs of the trucks. The figure didn't move, didn't react in any way to the convoy of trucks stopped in front of him. Finally, Bill forced himself to act. He reached for the door handle, intending to step out and confront the stranger, but something held him back, a deep, instinctual fear that warned him not to leave the safety of the truck. As he hesitated, the figure slowly raised its head, revealing a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Bill felt a surge of terror as those eyes locked onto him, freezing him in place. And then, without warning, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog as if it had never been there. Bill sat in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. He knew it hadn't been a trick of the light or a figment of his imagination. The figure had been real, and it had been watching them. He took a deep breath and tried to shake off the fear that clung to him like the mist outside. "We're moving on," he said into the radio, his voice firmer than he felt. "Stay close, and keep your eyes peeled." The convoy started moving again, but the tension in the air was thicker than the fog. They drove on in silence, each driver lost in their thoughts, their eyes darting nervously to the sides of the road, searching for any sign of the mysterious figure. As they neared the end of Devil's Pass, the fog began to thin, and the rain lessened to a steady drizzle. The relief in the convoy was almost palpable, the drivers silently thankful to be leaving the treacherous mountain road behind. But just as they thought they were in the clear, the radio crackled to life again, this time with a voice that didn't belong to any of them. It was a low, raspy whisper, filled with a malevolent glee that sent a shiver down Bill's spine. "You can't outrun the past," the voice hissed. "You can't escape what you've done." Bill's heart raced as he grabbed the radio, his hand trembling. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the only response was a chilling laugh that echoed through the cab. The radio went silent, leaving Bill with nothing but the sound of his own rapid breathing. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from before, but there was nothing there, only the faint glow of Jake and Sam's headlights behind him. They continued on, the road eventually leveling out as they descended into the valley below. But the unease lingered, the ominous words from the mysterious voice replaying over and over in Bill's mind. By the time they reached the mining site, the sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the mountains. The convoy pulled into the staging area, and the drivers climbed out of their trucks, grateful to have made it through the night unscathed. But the tension hadn't left them. Bill could see it in the way Jake's hands shook as he lit a cigarette, and in the way Sam kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. "What do you think that was, Big Rig?" Jake asked, his voice unsteady. "That voice on the radio, that wasn't just a prank, was it?" Bill shook his head, his expression grim. "No, it wasn't," he said. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't a prank." Sam nodded, his bravado from earlier completely gone. "Weird stuff happens on Devil's Pass," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. "Maybe it was just the road, playing tricks on us." But Bill knew better. He had been on too many roads, seen too many things to dismiss what had happened as just a trick of the mind. There was something about Devil's Pass, something dark and malevolent that lingered in the fog, waiting for those who dared to travel its twisted path. They spent the day unloading the equipment, but the events of the night before weighed heavily on their minds. As they prepared to head back, Bill made a decision. "We're not taking Devil's Pass on the way back," Bill announced, his voice leaving no room for argument. The other two truckers looked at him, relief flickering in their eyes. "Are you sure?" Sam asked, though he was clearly hoping for a yes. "The other route adds a couple of hours to the trip, and the company won't be too happy." Bill met Sam's gaze, his expression hard. I don't care about the company's timeline. I'm not risking another run through that place. Jake nodded in agreement. I'm with you, Big Rig. Whatever was out there last night, I don't want to see it again. They all silently agreed, and soon after finishing the unloading, they took the longer, safer route back. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the tension from the night before easing slightly with the daylight. But the unease lingered, like a shadow at the back of their minds. As they drove, the mountains gradually fell away behind them, replaced by rolling hills and eventually the flatlands. The drive was smooth, almost monotonous, a stark contrast to the harrowing journey through Devil's Pass. But none of them complained. The ordinary was a welcome relief after what they had experienced. Hours passed, and the convoy neared the small town where they planned to stop for the night. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. Bill could feel the exhaustion in his bones, but the thought of a warm meal and a bed kept him going. But as they approached the town, something strange happened. The radio, which had been silent for most of the day, crackled to life again. This time, it was filled with static, but through the crackling noise, a faint voice could be heard, just on the edge of comprehension. Turn back, the voice whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. You can't run. Bill's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at the radio as if it might offer some explanation, but the static continued, the words repeating in that same chilling whisper. Jake's voice came through the radio next, shaky and full of fear. Did you hear that, Big Rig? Did you hear what it said? Bill hesitated before answering. Yeah, I heard it. But we're not turning back. Keep driving. The static persisted for a few more minutes, then abruptly cut out, leaving only the hum of the truck engines and the steady thrum of tires on asphalt. They reached the town as dusk fell, pulling into the parking lot of a small, roadside motel. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the lot. The drivers climbed out of their trucks, weary but grateful for the stop. Inside the motel, the air was thick with the smell of stale smoke and old carpet. The clerk, an elderly woman with a kind face, checked them in without much fuss. As Bill signed the register, he noticed something peculiar. The date on the page was from 1979, a good 5 years earlier. Is this right? Bill asked, pointing to the date. The clerk glanced down at it and smiled. Oh, don't mind that. This old place is stuck in time, it seems. Never could keep the register updated. Bill nodded, though he felt a prickle of unease. He took the keys and handed them out to the others, then headed to his room. It was a small, cramped space, but the bed looked inviting enough. He was about to collapse onto it when a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Jake standing there, his face pale. Can I come in, Big Rig? I don't want to be alone right now. Bill stepped aside, letting Jake in. The younger trucker sat on the edge of the bed, his hands shaking slightly. I can't stop thinking about that voice, he confessed. It felt like it was talking to me. Bill sat down in the chair by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. It wasn't just talking to you, Jake. It was talking to all of us. Jake looked at him, eyes wide with fear. What do you think it meant? You can't run, what does that mean? Bill didn't answer right away. He had been turning that phrase over in his mind ever since he'd heard it, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how he thought about it, he kept coming back to the same unsettling conclusion. It means that whatever we saw back there, it's not done with us, Bill said finally. It's still out there, and it's not going to let us go that easily. Jake swallowed hard, fear evident in his eyes. What do we do, Big Rig? Bill sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. We stay here tonight, get some rest, and head out in the morning. And we keep our eyes open. Whatever happens, we stick together." Jake nodded, though it was clear he wasn't comforted by Bill's words. They spent the rest of the evening in silence, each man lost in his thoughts. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and they turned in for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. Bill lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the past day. Every creak of the old motel, every gust of wind outside the window, made him jump, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, he finally drifted off, his sleep fitful and disturbed by strange, fragmented dreams. He saw the figure from the road again, standing in the fog, its hollow eyes staring at him with an intensity that burned into his soul. When Bill woke, the first light of dawn was creeping through the curtains. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare. But the unease lingered, like a shadow clinging to the edges of his mind. He got dressed and met the others in the parking lot. They all looked rough, the sleepless night etched on their faces. Without much conversation, they climbed into their trucks and headed out, eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Devil's Pass. The drive was uneventful, the miles slipping by in a blur of asphalt and countryside. But as they neared the outskirts of the town where their journey had begun, something strange happened. The radio crackled to life again, this time with a voice that was eerily familiar. It was the same voice they had heard before, but this time it was clear, as if the person was sitting right there in the cab with them. "You can't escape," the voice said, calm and measured. "You've been marked." Bill's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't respond, didn't even try to turn off the radio. He just kept driving, his heart pounding in his chest. As the voice continued, a chill settled over the cab, the temperature dropping noticeably. "You're not the first," it said. "And you won't be the last. The road claims all who dare to defy it." Bill felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had heard stories about haunted roads, about curses that followed those who traveled them. But he had never believed in any of it, until now. The voice fell silent, leaving a heavy, oppressive stillness in its wake. Bill didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fight something he couldn't see, couldn't understand. They continued driving, the tension in the air palpable. No one spoke, each man lost in his own thoughts, the fear gnawing at the edges of their sanity. As they approached the town, Bill noticed something odd. The streets were empty, the buildings dark, as if the place had been abandoned. There were no cars, no people, just an eerie silence that seemed to swallow up the sound of the truck's engines. Bill pulled into the parking lot of the diner where they had planned to stop for breakfast, but it too was dark and empty. He got out of the truck, looking around, his unease growing with each passing second. The others followed, their expressions mirroring his own. "Where is everyone?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bill didn't answer. He had no answers to give. All he knew was that something was very wrong. They stood there in the empty parking lot, the early morning light casting long shadows around them. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came the sound of an engine, faint at first, but growing louder, closer. They all turned, looking down the road, their hearts pounding in their chests. A truck was coming, its headlights cutting through the morning mist. But as it drew nearer, something about it seemed off, its shape distorted, its movements unnatural. The truck pulled into the parking lot, and as it did, the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. The door opened, and out stepped a man, tall, gaunt, with a face that looked eerily familiar. Bill felt a jolt of recognition, his blood running cold. It was the same man they had seen on Devil's Pass, the same pale, hollow-eyed figure that had stood in their way. The man smiled, a chilling, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I told you," he said, his voice carrying through the still air. "You can't escape." Bill felt a surge of fear, but also anger. He had had enough of this, enough of the fear, enough of the games. He took a step forward, his fists clenched. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of defiance and fear. The man's smile widened, a sinister grin that sent chills down Bill's spine. "What I want," he repeated, as if savoring the words. "I want what the road demands, your fear, your soul. You've already given it a taste, and now it hungers for more." Bill glanced back at his fellow truckers, who were all frozen in place, their eyes wide with terror. He could see that they were barely holding it together, the reality of the situation fraying the edges of their sanity. The man's hollow eyes fixed on Bill, as if staring straight through him. "You chose to defy the road, to turn away from it. But the road never forgets. It never forgives." Bill swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of the man's words pressing down on him, the suffocating sense of inevitability. But he refused to back down, refused to let this thing, whatever it was, take them without a fight. "You can go back," the man continued, his voice soft and persuasive. "Return to Devil's Pass. Surrender yourselves to the road. It will be over quickly. No more running. No more fear." Bill shook his head, the movement small but resolute. "We're not going back. Whatever you are, whatever this is, we're done with it. We're leaving." The man's expression darkened, the smile fading from his lips. "You can try," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But you'll find that some roads are inescapable." With that, the man turned and climbed back into the truck. The engine roared to life, the sound echoing ominously in the empty parking lot. As the truck pulled away, the fog seemed to gather around it, swallowing it whole until it vanished into the mist. For a moment, the truckers stood in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. Then, as if shaken from a trance, they quickly moved back to their trucks, the urgency of escape driving them forward. They piled into their cabs, started their engines, and pulled out of the lot, the eerie stillness of the town left behind. But the fear lingered, clinging to them like a second skin. The road stretched out before them, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the misty morning light. As they drove, the radio remained silent, the static gone, leaving only the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on the road. But the memory of the man's words echoed in their minds, the unsettling thought that they were not truly free of Devil's Pass. Hours passed, and they finally crossed the town's border, the familiar landscape of their home territory coming into view. Relief washed over them, though it was tinged with lingering dread. They had made it out, but at what cost? When they finally reached the truck depot, they parked their rigs and climbed out, the exhaustion hitting them all at once. Bill turned to the others, his expression weary but determined. "We made it," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction he had hoped for. Sam and Jake nodded, though they looked just as drained. The three of them stood in the parking lot, the sense of unease still hanging over them like a dark cloud. "We're done with that route," Bill said firmly. "Whatever happens, we're not going back to Devil's Pass." The others agreed without hesitation. The decision was unspoken but absolute, they would avoid that cursed road at all costs. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal, the memory of their ordeal fading but never fully disappearing. They avoided the subject of Devil's Pass, each man burying the fear deep within, hoping that it would stay hidden. But late at night, when the world was quiet and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever, Bill would find himself thinking about the road, about the man with hollow eyes, and the chilling words that had haunted him ever since. "You can't escape." And though he would never admit it out loud, a part of him wondered if those words held a terrible truth. If perhaps, one day, the road would come calling again, demanding the fear and the souls it had been denied. But for now, they drove different routes, safer paths that kept them far from the shadow of Devil's Pass. And though the unease never fully left them, they clung to the hope that they had left the darkness behind. Yet, in the stillness of the night, when the world was draped in shadows and the silence was thick with the weight of unseen things, Bill could still hear the whisper of the road, calling to him from the depths of his memory, a haunting reminder that some journeys never truly end. 3. The Haunting of Raven's Hollow. The road to Raven's Hollow twisted and turned through the dense forest, its black asphalt winding like a serpent through the ancient trees. Thick, gnarled branches arched overhead, their leaves creating a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting the narrow road in perpetual shadow. The place was a maze of dark paths and hidden dangers, known only to the few who dared to enter. David Carlson, a seasoned truck driver, had been driving for over 20 years and had seen his fair share of strange things on the road, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would encounter in Raven's Hollow. It was late in the evening when David got the call from his dispatcher, instructing him to pick up a special delivery from a small, secluded town nestled deep within the mountains. The pay was good, too good to pass up, but the instructions were vague and the destination unknown to him. He was given a set of coordinates instead of an address and was told that the pickup would be at a place called Raven's Hollow. The name alone sent a chill down his spine, but David was a practical man, not one to be swayed by superstition or fear. He set out early the next morning, his truck loaded with supplies, following the GPS as it led him deeper into the heart of the wilderness. As the miles passed, the road grew narrower, the trees thicker, until the outside world seemed to disappear entirely, swallowed by the dark, impenetrable forest. After hours of driving, he finally arrived at the coordinates. Raven's Hollow was less a town and more a cluster of old, decaying buildings huddled together like skeletons in the mist. The place had an eerie, abandoned feel to it, the kind that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. David pulled his truck to a stop in what appeared to be the town square, a small, open area surrounded by crumbling brick structures and overgrown vegetation. He stepped out of the cab, the creak of his boots on the gravel the only sound in the oppressive silence. The air was thick with fog, swirling around him in ghostly tendrils, and the sky was a dull, bruised gray, as if even the sun had forsaken this place. There was something unsettling about the stillness, a sense of being watched, though no one was in sight. David took a deep breath and walked toward the only building that seemed somewhat intact, a large, two-story structure with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. The sign above the door was barely legible, but he could make out the faded letters spelling out Raven's Hollow Inn. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and decay. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, David noticed a figure sitting behind a large, wooden desk at the far end of the room. The man was old, his skin pale and thin, stretched tight over his bones like parchment. His eyes were sunken and hollow, with an unsettling glint that made David uneasy. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow," the man said in a raspy voice that seemed to echo through the empty inn. "You must be the driver." David nodded, forcing a polite smile. "That's right. I'm here to pick up a delivery." The old man's lips curled into a smile, though it was anything but reassuring. "Ah, yes. The delivery. It's out back, in the warehouse. But first, you must sign the ledger." David hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the desk. The old man slid a large, leather-bound book across the desk toward him, its pages yellowed with age. There was no pen, only an old-fashioned quill and an inkpot. "This is a bit old school, isn't it?" David said with a forced chuckle. The old man's smile widened. It's tradition. Everyone who comes to Raven's Hollow must sign the ledger. David dipped the quill into the ink and scrawled his name across the page. As soon as he lifted the quill, he felt a strange, prickling sensation in the back of his mind, like an electric shock that was there and gone in an instant. He shook off the feeling and handed the quill back to the old man, who closed the ledger with a soft thud. You may proceed to the warehouse now. Just follow the path around the side of the building. Thanks, David said, eager to finish the job and get out of this unsettling place. He left the inn and walked around the side of the building, where a narrow, overgrown path led to a large, decrepit warehouse at the edge of the forest. The structure was old, its metal siding rusted and its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. As he approached the warehouse, the air grew colder, the fog thickening around him until he could barely see more than a few feet in front of him. The sense of unease that had been gnawing at him since his arrival grew stronger, but he pressed on, determined to complete the job. He reached the warehouse door and hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and rusted metal. The only light came from a few small windows high up on the walls, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. David stepped inside, his footsteps echoing loudly in the cavernous space. The warehouse was filled with old, forgotten machinery in wooden crates stacked haphazardly against the walls. In the center of the room, he saw a large wooden crate, about the size of a coffin, with his name scrawled across the top in thick, black letters. He approached the crate, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something about it that filled him with a deep sense of dread, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. He reached out and touched the wood, which was cold and smooth under his fingers. Suddenly, the crate began to shake, the lid rattling as if something inside was trying to get out. David jumped back, his heart leaping into his throat. He stared at the crate, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The warehouse fell silent again, the only sound the blood rushing in David's ears. He stood frozen, staring at the crate, unsure of what to do next. After a long moment, he forced himself to move, his hands trembling as he reached for the lid. He pried it open, the wood creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, he saw a large, heavy wooden box, its surface covered in strange, intricate carvings. He didn't recognize the symbols, but they filled him with a deep sense of unease. He knew he should leave, should get back in his truck and drive away from this place as fast as he could, but something compelled him to stay, to see this through. He reached down and grabbed the box, lifting it out of the crate. It was heavy, the weight of it pressing down on his arms as he carried it to the back of his truck. He loaded it onto the truck bed and secured it with straps, then climbed back into the cab, his hands still shaking. As he drove away from Raven's Hollow, the fog lifted slightly, allowing him to see the road ahead more clearly. But the sense of unease didn't leave him. It clung to him like a shroud, the memory of the strange symbols and the shaking crate haunting his thoughts. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the road and the familiar hum of the engine beneath him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get the image of that crate out of his mind. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, the sky turning a deep shade of red as the light faded. David's eyes grew heavy, the exhaustion of the long day finally catching up with him. He considered pulling over to rest, but the thought of stopping made his skin crawl. He didn't want to be alone in the dark with that box in the back of his truck. So he pressed on, his eyelids growing heavier with each passing mile. The road stretched out before him, a ribbon of darkness winding through the night. The trees on either side loomed tall and menacing, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As the last light of day faded, the darkness seemed to close in around him, the shadows deepening and thickening until they were almost tangible. He turned on his headlights, the beams cutting through the night, but even they seemed weak and ineffective against the oppressive blackness. He blinked, trying to shake off the sleepiness that threatened to overtake him. But as he blinked, he saw something in the distance, two glowing red eyes staring back at him from the side of the road. David's heart skipped a beat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The eyes were too high off the ground to belong to any animal he knew, and they were watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He kept driving, his eyes locked on the glowing orbs. As he got closer, he saw the outline of a figure standing just off the side of the road. It was tall and thin, its limbs elongated and twisted in unnatural angles. The eyes followed him as he passed, their red glow piercing through the darkness. David's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. He pressed down on the accelerator, desperate to put the unsettling figure behind him. The truck roared forward, the engine's growl mingling with the pounding of his heart. He dared not look back, focusing instead on the road ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The miles seemed to stretch endlessly as he drove through the night. The darkness was now so dense that it felt like a living entity, pressing in on him from all sides. The glow of the truck's headlights barely penetrated the thick blackness, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to dance menacingly on the edge of his vision. David's fatigue was becoming unbearable. He fought to keep his eyes open, the desire for rest tugging at him with each passing minute. His mind replayed the unsettling encounter with the red eyes, the image burned into his memory like a cruel joke. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, watched by unseen eyes that lurked just beyond the reach of the headlights. As the night wore on, the fog began to roll in again, thick and oppressive. It curled around the truck like a shroud, muffling the sounds of the engine and the world outside. The visibility dropped dramatically, and David slowed the truck to a crawl, squinting through the murky haze. Suddenly, the truck's headlights caught a glimpse of something unusual, a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road. David's heart raced as he slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just inches from the figure. The figure was tall, draped in tattered clothing that seemed to blend with the darkness. Its face was obscured by a hood, but David could see the faint glint of eyes peering out from beneath the shadow. The figure stood motionless, its presence commanding and eerie. David's hands shook as he reached for the horn, but before he could sound it, the figure slowly raised a hand, palm out, as if signaling him to stop. The motion was deliberate and almost graceful, but it sent a jolt of fear through David. He sat frozen in the driver's seat, staring at the figure. The oppressive silence was broken only by the distant sound of the foghorn from a ship somewhere far off. The figure's eyes seemed to lock onto his, an intense, penetrating gaze that made David feel as though his very soul was being examined. Time seemed to stretch as he and the figure stared at each other. David could feel the cold sweat on his brow, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure's eyes were a deep, glowing red, the same color as those he had seen earlier. It was as if the same malevolent presence had followed him from Raven's Hollow. Finally, the figure lowered its hand and turned away, beginning to walk slowly down the road. David's mind raced, torn between the urge to drive away and the compulsion to follow the figure. Something about it felt inexplicably important, a missing piece to the puzzle of his unsettling night. As if driven by an invisible force, David put the truck in gear and began to follow the figure. The truck's headlights cut a narrow path through the fog, illuminating the figure's path ahead. The figure walked with an unhurried pace, its movements fluid and almost hypnotic. The road twisted and turned, each curve and bend in the path revealing more of the shadowy figure. The fog seemed to thicken with each mile, the darkness closing in tighter. David's sense of direction was becoming disoriented, and he found himself questioning the wisdom of following this mysterious entity. Eventually, the figure led him to a secluded clearing surrounded by towering trees. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated mansion, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with vines. The mansion appeared as if it had been abandoned for decades, its windows dark and empty, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The figure moved toward the mansion, vanishing into the darkness. David stopped the truck at the edge of the clearing, staring at the mansion with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The place exuded a palpable sense of malevolence, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He knew he should turn back, return to the safety of the road, but an inexplicable urge drove him to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight from the truck's cab and approached the mansion, each step echoing in the stillness of the night. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly as he pushed it open. The interior of the mansion was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay and neglect. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing a grand entrance hall with a once ornate chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. As he ventured deeper into the mansion, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He could hear faint whispers, like the murmur of a distant crowd, drifting through the empty halls. The sound was unsettling, and he couldn't quite tell if it was real or a trick of his tired mind. He explored room after room, each one more decrepit than the last. The mansion was filled with rotting furniture, dusty portraits, and broken remnants of a bygone era. It was as if time had stopped in this place, preserving it in a state of eerie, frozen decay. In one of the rooms, he found an old library with shelves lined with ancient, leather-bound books. The dust on the floor was undisturbed, suggesting that no one had been there for a long time. David's curiosity got the better of him, and he began to browse through the books, hoping to find something that would explain the mansion's mysterious allure. Among the books, he discovered a large, old tome bound in cracked leather. The cover was embossed with strange symbols, and the pages inside were filled with handwritten notes and illustrations depicting dark rituals and arcane symbols. David's heart pounded as he flipped through the pages, realizing that he had stumbled upon something deeply unsettling. The more he read, the more he understood that this mansion was no ordinary place. It was a site of dark rituals, a place where ancient and malevolent forces were summoned. The whispers he had heard were the echoes of those who had once gathered here, their spirits trapped between the realms of the living and the dead. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The figure he had followed, the strange occurrences in Raven's Hollow, all of it was connected to this place. The mansion was a focal point of dark energy, a place where the veil between worlds was thin and vulnerable. David's sense of urgency grew. He needed to leave before the darkness claimed him as well. He closed the tome and hurried out of the library, retracing his steps through the mansion. As he reached the front door, he felt a cold draft sweep through the hall, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He stumbled out into the night, the fog swirling around him as he made his way back to the truck. The sense of being followed was more intense than ever, and he could feel a chilling presence closing in on him. He started the truck and sped away from the mansion, the fog parting slightly to reveal the road ahead. The journey back was tense and fraught with anxiety, every shadow and sound in the night seemingly a threat. He drove with a single-minded determination, desperate to escape the clutches of the dark forces he had unwittingly disturbed. As dawn approached, the fog began to lift, and the first light of day began to push back the darkness. David finally reached the edge of the forest, the road stretching out before him like a lifeline. He breathed a sigh of relief as he drove out of the forest and into the safety of the open highway. The sun rose in the sky, casting a warm, reassuring light over the landscape. David glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see the shadowy figure or the haunted mansion looming behind him. But the road was empty, the night's horrors fading with the morning light. He made his way to his destination, his hands still trembling from the night's events. The experience had left him shaken, but he was determined to put it behind him. He delivered the box as instructed, though he kept the details of his ordeal to himself. The less said about Raven's Hollow, the better. As he drove back to his own home, he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still lurking, just beyond the edge of the road, waiting for its chance to pull him back. The mansion, the figure, the whispers, they were all part of a larger, darker world that he had glimpsed but could never fully understand. And though the daylight offered him a sense of relief, David knew that the night had left its mark on him. The road to Raven's Hollow had led him into a realm of ancient and malevolent forces, and the echoes of his encounter would haunt him long after the fog had cleared. 4. The Phantom Truck. It was a bitterly cold November night when Jim Reynolds, a seasoned long-haul truck driver, found himself hauling a load through the desolate stretches of highway in rural Montana. The crisp air cut through the small cab of his truck, making the heaters hum a constant companion as he maneuvered his 18-wheeler down the endless, straight road. The night was unusually quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming of the tires against the asphalt and the occasional gust of wind that whistled through the gaps in the truck's weathered frame. The highway was a lonely ribbon of gray cutting through a sea of darkness, with nothing but the dim glow of the truck's headlights piercing through the void. Jim had been driving for hours and was looking forward to reaching the next truck stop where he could rest. As the hours ticked by, he noticed an unsettling sense of isolation, amplified by the absence of other vehicles. The radio offered no solace, only static and the occasional burst of static-laden music, contributing to the eerie atmosphere that enveloped him. Around midnight, as he was navigating a particularly desolate stretch of road flanked by dense forest on either side, Jim saw something unusual in the distance. A faint light flickered ahead, like a distant star struggling to shine through the encroaching darkness. As he drew closer, he realized it wasn't a star but the headlights of another truck. Jim's curiosity piqued. He hadn't seen another truck on this stretch of road for hours. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel and focused on the approaching vehicle. It was a large truck, much like his own, though its lights seemed unusually dim, almost ghostly. He flipped on his CB radio, trying to reach out. "This is Big Jim coming up behind you. You out there?" Jim's voice crackled through the radio waves, but there was no response. The silence was broken only by the static from his radio. As he got closer, Jim noticed that the other truck was traveling at a disturbingly slow pace. Its lights were barely illuminating the road ahead, casting long, wavering shadows across the asphalt. Jim decided to pull up alongside it, hoping to offer assistance if needed. The other truck, however, appeared to be moving on its own, with no visible driver inside. Jim's heart skipped a beat. The empty cab, visible through the partially open side window, was devoid of any life. The truck's engine was running, but there was no sign of the person who should have been behind the wheel. A chill ran down Jim's spine. He tried again on the CB radio. "Hey, this is Big Jim. I see you're having trouble. You need help?" The radio crackled with a burst of static but remained silent otherwise. Jim's unease grew. He looked around, trying to see if there was any other sign of life or an explanation for the mysterious truck. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees like dark sentinels watching the strange encounter unfold. Suddenly, the truck's lights flickered, and it began to slow even more. Jim, feeling an eerie sense of urgency, pulled ahead and got a good look at the truck's license plate and markings. The truck was old, its paint peeling and rusting, giving it an antiquated appearance that clashed with the modern highway setting. As Jim prepared to pull away, he noticed a strange, ghostly figure standing on the side of the road. The figure was hazy and translucent, its form barely discernible. It seemed to be pointing towards the truck as if directing it, or perhaps warning it. Jim's heart raced, his mind struggling to grasp what he was seeing. Without thinking, Jim hit the accelerator and sped away from the phantom truck. The road stretched out before him, illuminated by his own headlights. The eerie figure and the ghostly truck quickly faded into the night behind him. As he drove on, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The image of the empty cab and the spectral figure burned into his memory. Hours passed, and Jim finally reached the truck stop he had been longing for. He parked his truck and went inside, his hands still trembling from the encounter. He shared his experience with the other drivers at the stop, but they only offered skeptical glances and shrugged it off as a figment of his imagination or a trick of fatigue. The next day, Jim continued his route, but the memory of the phantom truck lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, an unseen presence that lurked just beyond the edge of his perception. The strange encounter had left him with a deep sense of foreboding. Weeks went by, and the phantom truck became an unsettling memory, but Jim couldn't escape the nagging sense of dread that accompanied him on his drives. One cold evening, while passing through the same stretch of highway, he decided to take a detour and revisit the area where he had seen the ghostly truck. The road was as desolate as ever, and the forest loomed darkly on either side. Jim drove cautiously, his headlights cutting through the fog that had begun to settle over the road. He noticed that the area where he had encountered the phantom truck seemed to have changed. The road was now overgrown, and the trees appeared to be encroaching on the asphalt, as if reclaiming it. As he slowed down to survey the area, he spotted an old, abandoned truck parked by the side of the road. It was identical to the one he had seen weeks earlier, worn, rusty, and covered in a thick layer of dust. Jim's heart pounded as he approached the truck. He got out of his cab and walked over to the abandoned vehicle. The truck was clearly out of commission, its tires flat and its engine rusted. Jim peered through the window and saw that the interior was eerily similar to what he had seen that night, an empty cab with faded upholstery and an old CB radio. The truck's license plate matched the one he had seen before. A sense of dread settled over him as he took in the scene. It was as if time had stopped for this truck, preserving it in the exact state he had encountered it. The forest around it seemed to close in, the trees creating an almost oppressive barrier. As Jim stood there, he heard a faint sound coming from the truck's radio. It was a ghostly, distorted version of the radio chatter he had heard that night. The static grew louder, and he could make out fragmented voices, whispers, and eerie laughter. He backed away from the truck, his breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. The spectral figure he had seen before appeared once more, standing amidst the fog and shadows. Its presence was more pronounced now, its glowing eyes fixed on him with a haunting intensity. Jim felt an icy chill as the figure slowly moved toward him. The air seemed to grow colder, and the forest around him became an almost impenetrable darkness. He turned and ran back to his truck, stumbling over the uneven ground. His heart pounded as he jumped into the cab and started the engine. The fog swirled around him as he sped away from the abandoned truck, the spectral figure fading into the mist. The road stretched out before him, the familiar stretch of highway offering a semblance of safety. As dawn approached, Jim finally reached a more populated area. He pulled into a truck stop and parked, his hands still trembling from the experience. The other drivers listened to his story with a mix of skepticism and concern, their own faces reflecting the unease that Jim felt. Jim continued his long-haul trucking, but the memory of the phantom truck haunted him. He took a different route whenever possible, avoiding the desolate stretch of highway where he had encountered the eerie apparition. Though he never saw the ghostly truck again, the encounter left him with a lingering sense of unease and a wariness of the darkness that lurks on the open road. The phantom truck became a local legend among truck drivers, a story shared in hushed tones at truck stops and rest areas. Jim's tale served as a chilling reminder of the strange and unexplained phenomena that can occur when traversing the lonely highways, where the line between reality and the supernatural can sometimes become frighteningly thin. Despite his best efforts to forget, Jim couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night, a few months after the initial encounter, he found himself driving through another remote area, this time in the deep south. The landscape was different, but the sense of isolation was the same. The road was empty, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the swampland that flanked the highway. As he drove on, a familiar unease crept over him. The air seemed to grow heavier, and the shadows around him deepened. He checked his mirrors frequently, half expecting to see the ghostly truck trailing behind him. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the oppressive darkness. Around midnight, Jim spotted a figure on the side of the road. It was a hitchhiker, a rare sight in such a remote area. Against his better judgment, Jim slowed down and pulled over. The figure, a young woman, approached the truck with hesitant steps. She looked exhausted, her clothes dirty and torn, as if she had been walking for miles. Jim rolled down his window. "You need a ride?" he asked. The woman nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Yes, please. I've been out here for hours. Something strange is going on." Jim unlocked the passenger door, and the woman climbed in. As she settled into the seat, Jim couldn't help but notice the look of terror on her face. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to break the tension. "Emily," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Jim glanced at her, concern etched on his face. "Emily, what happened out here? You look like you've seen a ghost." Emily hesitated, her eyes darting nervously to the side mirror, as if expecting something to appear out of the darkness. "I don't know if you'll believe me," she began, her voice trembling. "But there's something out here, something that's been following me." Jim's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What do you mean, something?" Emily shivered, pulling her tattered coat tighter around herself. "I was on my way to visit family. My car broke down a few miles back, and my phone's dead. I started walking, thinking I could flag someone down, but the road was empty. Then, I started hearing it, a truck, but not like any normal truck. The engine, it didn't sound right. It was like a low growl, almost like it was alive. When I turned around to see it, there was nothing there, just the sound, following me." Jim felt a cold sweat form at the back of his neck. He had heard similar stories from other truckers, tales of haunted stretches of road, ghostly vehicles that appeared out of nowhere, chasing unwary travelers. He tried to keep his voice steady. "Did you see anything else?" Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "A few minutes later, I saw lights in the distance. I thought it was another car, but as I got closer, I realized it was a truck, an old one, beat up, with rust all over. But there was something wrong with it. The lights were dim, almost like they were fading in and out. And then I saw it wasn't slowing down, it was speeding up, heading straight for me." Jim's heart pounded as he listened to Emily's story. He could almost picture the scene, the dark, empty road, the fog creeping in, and that mysterious truck bearing down on her. "What did you do?" he asked. "I jumped into the ditch on the side of the road," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "The truck roared past, and when I looked up, it was gone. Just like that. But I swear, I could still hear the engine, like it was circling back. I didn't know what else to do, so I started running." Jim glanced out into the darkened landscape, half expecting to see the phantom truck lurking in the shadows. The idea of something supernatural out there, something that could materialize without warning, sent a shiver down his spine. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "You're safe now," he said, trying to sound reassuring, even though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Emily nodded, but her fear was palpable. "I don't know what it was," she whispered. "But it wasn't just a truck. There was something evil about it, something that felt wrong." Jim didn't have an answer. He had been driving these roads for years and had seen his share of strange things, but nothing like this. He started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of the phantom truck. The road stretched out before them, long and empty, with only the occasional flicker of headlights from distant vehicles. They drove in silence for a while, the tension in the cab thickening with each passing mile. The fog had thickened, creating an almost surreal landscape around them, with the ghostly outlines of trees and the occasional flash of something moving in the darkness. Jim kept the truck steady, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at him. The story Emily had told him echoed in his mind, mingling with the legends he had heard over the years, stories of truckers who vanished, of ghostly vehicles that pursued the living, of curses that lingered on forgotten roads. As they continued on, the fog seemed to take on a life of its own, swirling around the truck in thick, opaque tendrils. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and Jim had to slow down to a crawl, his headlights barely piercing through the mist. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft rumble of the engine and Emily's shallow breathing beside him. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Jim caught a glimpse of something, a shape moving through the fog, keeping pace with the truck. His heart skipped a beat as he tried to make it out. It was just a fleeting shadow, gone as quickly as it had appeared. He gripped the wheel tighter, telling himself it was just a trick of the light, nothing more. But then he saw it again. This time, it was clearer, the unmistakable outline of a truck, old and rusted, its dim headlights flickering like candles in the wind. It was trailing them, matching their speed, but always staying just out of full view, like a predator stalking its prey. "Emily," Jim said, his voice tense, "I need you to stay calm. But I think that truck you saw, it's behind us." Emily's eyes widened in terror. She turned slowly to look through the back window, her breath hitching as she saw the ghostly vehicle trailing them. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's back." Jim's mind raced. He had no idea how to deal with something like this. He had faced breakdowns, bad weather, and even the occasional wild animal on the road, but nothing had prepared him for a phantom truck that seemed to defy the laws of reality. He pressed the accelerator, trying to put some distance between them and the apparition. The truck responded, speeding up effortlessly to match their pace. Jim glanced at the speedometer, 60 miles per hour, then 70. The phantom truck stayed right behind them, its headlights flickering ominously through the fog. Panic surged through Jim. "What does it want?" he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice trembling. "But it's not going to let us go." Jim pushed the truck harder, the engine roaring as they hurtled down the fog-choked highway. The phantom truck kept pace, never falling behind, its headlights like eyes watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fog closed in around them, making the world outside the truck feel like an endless maze of shadows and ghostly shapes. Jim's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his breath coming in short, quick gasps. He could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him, the fear that whatever was chasing them wasn't bound by the rules of the natural world. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled to life, filling the cab with a burst of static. Jim nearly jumped out of his seat, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. He reached for the radio, hesitating for a moment before pressing the talk button. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice wavering. For a moment, there was only static. Then, a voice came through, distorted and barely audible, as if coming from a great distance. "You can't escape." Jim's blood ran cold. The voice was low and gravelly, like the rumble of an engine. It didn't sound human. He glanced at Emily, who was staring at the radio with wide, terrified eyes. "Who are you?" Jim demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The voice crackled back, "This is my road." Jim's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard of haunted roads before, places where the spirits of the dead were said to linger, but he had never believed in them. Now, he wasn't so sure. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The reply came slowly, each word dripping with malice. "You are mine." Jim slammed the radio down, his mind racing. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. He glanced at the GPS, but the screen was flickering, the map distorting and twisting as if it couldn't keep up with their location. The road ahead was a blur of fog and shadows. Jim pushed the truck harder, the speedometer inching closer to 80. The phantom truck remained behind them, its lights flickering like the dying embers of a fire. Suddenly, the road ahead began to change. The once straight and predictable highway started to twist and turn, the asphalt warping into a labyrinth of curves and bends. Jim's stomach churned as he fought to keep the truck on the road, the tires screeching as they took the sharp turns. The fog thickened, swallowing up the world outside the cab. The only thing Jim could see was the narrow stretch of road ahead and the phantom truck in his mirrors, always there, always watching. Emily clung to her seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the door handle. "What's happening?" she cried, her voice breaking. "I don't know." Jim shouted back, his heart racing. "But we need to get out of here." The road continued to twist and turn, the landscape outside becoming more surreal with each passing mile. Trees bent and twisted in impossible angles, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The fog swirled and shifted, forming strange shapes and figures that seemed to move with a life of their own. Jim's mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline. He had no idea where they were or how to escape. All he knew was that the phantom truck was still behind them, an unrelenting force that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. Then, without warning, the road straightened out, the fog lifting just enough to reveal a bridge up ahead. It was an old, rickety-looking bridge, the kind that seemed like it had been there forever, forgotten by time. The wooden planks were weathered and worn, and the guardrails were barely more than rusted metal, leaning precariously over the edge. Below, the sound of rushing water echoed through the fog, hinting at a deep, treacherous river. Jim's heart skipped a beat. There was no way they could turn back now, the phantom truck was still hot on their trail, and the only way forward was across the bridge. He steeled himself and gripped the wheel, urging the truck onto the creaking structure. The moment the truck's tires touched the wooden planks, the bridge groaned in protest, as if warning them of the danger that lay ahead. Jim held his breath, easing the truck forward, every creak and groan of the bridge echoing in his ears like the beat of a drum. Emily's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, her face pale and drawn. "Are you sure this is safe?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's the only way," Jim replied, his own voice tight with tension. He didn't know if the bridge would hold, but he didn't have a choice. Behind them, the phantom truck's headlights continued to flicker in and out of the fog, a constant, malevolent presence. As they inched forward, the truck suddenly lurched to the side, the left wheels dropping dangerously close to the edge of the bridge. Jim quickly corrected, his heart pounding in his chest. The bridge swayed beneath them, the sound of the rushing water below growing louder and more ominous. Just as they were halfway across, the phantom truck appeared at the entrance to the bridge, its headlights piercing through the fog like twin orbs of doom. Jim could feel its presence like a dark shadow looming over them, and he knew that stopping now was not an option. He pressed down on the accelerator, urging the truck forward faster, the bridge groaning louder in response. The phantom truck followed suit, its engine roaring like a beast as it picked up speed. Jim's knuckles turned white as he fought to keep the truck steady, the planks beneath them creaking and cracking under the strain. They were almost across when the bridge gave an alarming shudder, a loud crack echoing through the air. Jim glanced in the rearview mirror and saw, to his horror, that the planks at the far end of the bridge had started to give way, crumbling into the river below. "We're not going to make it!" Emily screamed, her eyes wide with terror. "Yes, we are!" Jim shouted back, flooring the gas pedal. The truck surged forward, the bridge collapsing behind them, the sound of splintering wood and rushing water blending into a cacophony of chaos. With a final, desperate burst of speed, the truck shot off the end of the bridge, landing with a bone-jarring thud on solid ground. Jim struggled to keep control, the truck skidding and fishtailing as they hurtled down the road. The phantom truck, however, wasn't so lucky. Jim watched in the side mirror as the bridge gave way completely, the rusted metal and broken wood collapsing into the river below. The phantom truck seemed to hover in mid-air for a moment, its headlights flaring brightly, before it plummeted into the darkness, disappearing into the fog with a final, echoing roar. Jim didn't slow down until they were far down the road, the bridge and the phantom truck nothing more than a distant memory. He finally eased off the gas, his hands trembling as he brought the truck to a stop by the side of the road. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the soft ticking of the cooling engine and the distant murmur of the river. Jim leaned back in his seat, letting out a shaky breath. "I can't believe we made it." Emily was silent, her eyes still wide with shock. She finally turned to look at him, her voice barely more than a whisper. What was that?" Jim shook his head slowly, his mind reeling from the events of the night. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it was, it's gone now." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the night's terror slowly lifting as the fog began to clear. The road ahead was calm and quiet, the only sign of life the distant lights of a town just coming into view. Jim started the engine again, pulling back onto the road. "Let's get you to safety," he said, offering Emily a reassuring smile. She nodded, the fear slowly fading from her eyes, replaced by a tentative sense of relief. As they drove away, the night returned to its usual stillness, the fog dissipating to reveal the clear, starry sky above. But in the back of Jim's mind, the memory of the phantom truck lingered, a dark shadow that would haunt his dreams for many nights to come. And though they had escaped, a part of him knew that the phantom truck was still out there, waiting for the next unwary traveler to cross its path. 5. The rest stop haunting. The rain began as a light drizzle, but soon it evolved into a relentless downpour that drummed against the windshield of Marcus's truck. The windshield wipers worked furiously, their steady rhythm a lonely accompaniment to the monotony of the highway. The dark road stretched out ahead, disappearing into the night like an endless ribbon. Marcus had been on the road for hours, and fatigue was starting to settle deep in his bones. He'd been driving cross-country, hauling a load of cargo from New York to Los Angeles, with little rest in between. The storm made the journey even more grueling, reducing visibility to almost nothing and turning the highway into a treacherous path. He squinted through the rain, searching for a sign of relief, and finally, there it was, a rest stop just a few miles ahead. The bright, glowing sign was a beacon of hope in the bleak night. Marcus sighed in relief, his grip on the steering wheel relaxing slightly. He could finally take a break, stretch his legs, and maybe even catch a few winks before continuing on. As he pulled into the rest stop, he noticed that it was eerily empty. The parking lot, which could accommodate dozens of vehicles, held only a couple of cars. A lone semi-truck was parked on the far side, its driver nowhere in sight. The lights in the rest area cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance in the rain. Marcus parked his truck and turned off the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after the constant hum of the road. He stepped out into the rain, pulling his jacket tighter around him as the cold wind bit at his face. The air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and pine trees, a scent that always reminded him of long nights spent on the road. He made his way to the restroom area, the sound of his boots echoing in the emptiness. The rest stop was outdated, its paint peeling and signs faded, as though it had been forgotten by time. The vending machines buzzed quietly, their dim lights flickering occasionally, adding to the sense of desolation. Inside the restroom, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glare that made everything look washed out. Marcus splashed some cold water on his face, hoping to shake off the weariness. He glanced at his reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes stared back at him, framed by the lines and stubble of someone who'd seen too many miles and too few nights of sleep. As he dried his hands, he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, expecting to see another traveler, but the restroom was empty. The only movement was the slow drip of a leaking faucet. He shook his head, chalking it up to his tired mind playing tricks on him. After all, he'd been driving for hours with barely a break. He left the restroom and headed back to his truck, the rain having slowed to a gentle patter. As he approached his truck, he felt a strange unease settle over him, like he was being watched. He looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the dark shapes of the other vehicles and the empty expanse of the parking lot. He climbed into the cab and locked the doors, a habit ingrained from years on the road. The truck's interior was familiar and comforting, the seat worn from countless hours of sitting, the dashboard cluttered with maps and receipts. Marcus leaned back in his seat, letting out a long breath. He was exhausted, and the thought of closing his eyes for a few minutes was too tempting to resist. He reclined the seat and settled in, the sound of the rain lulling him into a light doze. But sleep didn't come easy. He kept waking up, startled by noises he couldn't quite place. The wind howling through the trees, the creak of metal as the truck shifted under the weight of the cargo, the distant hum of the highway, all these sounds seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. And then there was the tapping. At first, he thought it was just the rain, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too steady. It started softly, just a faint tap tap tap, like something lightly rapping against the side of the truck. Marcus sat up, his heart pounding in his chest, straining to hear over the blood rushing in his ears. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the passenger side of the truck. He reached over and switched on the interior light, but the cab was empty. He could see nothing outside through the rain-streaked window. Taking a deep breath, he rolled down the window slightly and peered out. The lot was empty, save for the two cars and the other truck, both sitting in silent stillness. The tapping had stopped, and all he could hear was the steady drum of rain. He rolled the window back up, convincing himself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch blown loose by the storm. He settled back into his seat, trying to calm his nerves. But sleep was out of the question now, his senses were on high alert, every noise making him jump. And then, without warning, the truck's engine roared to life. Marcus froze, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't touched the ignition, and yet the truck was rumbling beneath him, the dashboard lights flickering on. He fumbled for the keys, still hanging from his belt loop, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The truck revved loudly, the headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the rain-soaked parking lot. Marcus tried to turn off the engine, but the keys wouldn't fit into the ignition. It was like the truck had a mind of its own. Panic set in as the truck began to move, rolling forward slowly. Marcus slammed on the brakes, but they didn't respond. The truck kept rolling, picking up speed as it headed towards the exit of the rest stop. Marcus gripped the steering wheel, desperately trying to regain control. He steered the truck away from the exit, veering back into the lot, narrowly avoiding a collision with the other vehicles. The truck seemed to be fighting against him, pulling towards the road as if something unseen was guiding it. In a last-ditch effort, Marcus yanked the emergency brake, and the truck came to a screeching halt, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. The engine cut off abruptly, leaving him in sudden, deafening silence. Breathing heavily, Marcus sat there, trying to process what had just happened. His hands were trembling, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. He'd heard stories from other truckers about strange occurrences on the road, but he'd always dismissed them as just that, stories. But now, he wasn't so sure. He was about to get out and check the truck when he saw something in the side mirror that made his blood run cold. A figure was standing just behind the truck, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the rain and darkness. For a moment, Marcus was paralyzed with fear, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Who, or what, was standing out there? How had it appeared so suddenly, without a sound? He slowly reached for the door handle, his eyes never leaving the mirror. But as his hand touched the handle, the figure moved, slipping out of sight behind the truck. Marcus yanked the door open and jumped out, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around frantically, but the lot was empty. The figure had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving no trace. He stood there in the rain, his clothes soaked through, trying to steady his breathing. The unease he'd felt earlier had grown into a full-blown sense of dread, and he knew he couldn't stay here any longer. He climbed back into the truck and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life without hesitation, and this time, the truck responded to his control. He pulled out of the rest stop, his eyes scanning the mirrors for any sign of the figure, but the lot remained empty. As he drove away, the rain began to lighten, the storm finally passing. The miles ticked by, but the tension in Marcus's chest refused to ease. He kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see the figure standing by the side of the road, watching him. He didn't stop again until he reached a truck stop on the outskirts of a small town, miles away from the rest stop. The brightly lit gas station and the presence of other truckers milling about brought him a small measure of comfort. As he filled up his tank, he struck up a conversation with another driver, an older man with a weathered face and a thick, southern drawl. Marcus told him about the strange encounter at the rest stop, half expecting the man to laugh it off. But the older driver's expression turned serious. That rest stop, you mean the one about 50 miles back, off Highway 36? Marcus nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. I've heard stories about that place, the man said, lowering his voice. It's been around for decades, and truckers have been talking about strange things happening there for as long as I can remember. People say it's haunted. Marcus listened intently as the man continued. There was an accident there, years ago. A trucker lost control in a storm, just like tonight, and crashed into the restroom building. He didn't make it. Ever since then, folks have claimed to see strange things, figures in the shadows, trucks moving on their own, all sorts of weird stuff. A sense of unease settled over Marcus as he absorbed the older driver's words. He'd always dismissed ghost stories and tales of the supernatural, but what had happened at that rest stop couldn't be easily explained. Did anyone ever find out why those things happen? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The older driver shook his head, his weathered face shadowed by the brim of his cap. Ain't no one who's willing to stick around long enough to find out. Best advice I can give you is to avoid that place if you can. Some things out here on the road, they're just better left alone. Marcus felt a shiver run down his spine. He'd been on the road for years, had seen all kinds of strange and unsettling things, but nothing like this. The rest stop had felt wrong, like it was stuck in time, a place where the living and the dead might intersect. He thanked the older driver and finished fueling up, deciding to grab a cup of coffee before hitting the road again. As he entered the truck stop's small diner, the warmth and light provided some comfort, though the events of the night continued to gnaw at him. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and a tired-looking waitress greeted him with a weary smile. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked, her pen poised over a notepad. "Just a coffee," Marcus replied, sliding into a booth by the window. He needed something to keep him awake, something to help him focus. As the waitress poured his coffee, Marcus couldn't help but overhear the conversation between two truckers at the counter. They were talking in hushed tones, their faces serious. One of them mentioned something about a rest stop on Highway 36. Marcus's ears perked up. "Sorry to eavesdrop," he said, leaning forward slightly, "but did you say something about a rest stop on Highway 36? The two truckers exchanged glances before one of them, a burly man with a graying beard, nodded. "Yeah. You been there?" Marcus nodded. "I just left it a little while ago. Some weird stuff happened, and I'm trying to make sense of it." The bearded trucker let out a low whistle. "You're lucky you got out of there in one piece. There's something off about that place. Heard stories about truckers who stopped there and never came back." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, never came back?" The other trucker, a lean man with a worn baseball cap, leaned in closer. "There's been stories for years. Truckers stopping to rest and then just disappearing. Their rigs left behind, engines still running, but no sign of the driver. Some say they were taken by whatever haunts that place." Marcus's stomach churned. He thought about the figure he'd seen in the mirror, the way the truck had seemed to move on its own. The feeling of being watched. But why? What's causing it? "No one really knows," the bearded trucker replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Some say it's the spirit of that trucker who died in the crash. Others think it's something older, something that was there long before the highway was built. Best thing to do is keep your eyes straight ahead and don't look back," the trucker in the baseball cap added. "Whatever's out there, it feeds on fear. It latches onto you if you let it." Marcus felt a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. He hadn't looked back since leaving the rest stop, but now he felt an overwhelming urge to do just that, as if something, or someone, was lurking just outside his vision. He thanked the truckers for their time and advice, paid for his coffee, and returned to his truck. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. The highway stretched out before him, dark and empty, as if it was waiting for him. Marcus hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the ignition. He'd never been one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but tonight had shaken him to his core. There was something on that highway, something that defied explanation. He started the truck, the engine purring to life without incident. The warmth from the heater chased away the lingering chill, but it couldn't ease the tightness in his chest. Marcus took a deep breath and pulled out of the truck stop, merging back onto the highway. The mist was thick, wrapping around the truck like a blanket, obscuring the road ahead. The lights from his truck barely cut through the fog, making it feel as though he was driving through an endless void. His mind kept replaying the events at the rest stop, the tapping, the truck moving on its own, the figure in the mirror. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the road, but his thoughts kept drifting back. What if he hadn't stopped at that truck stop? What if he'd stayed at the rest stop? Would he have ended up like those other truckers, vanished without a trace? The miles passed slowly, the fog clinging to the road like a veil. Marcus kept a steady grip on the wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes scanning the mirrors for any sign of movement. The highway was deserted, no other cars or trucks in sight, just the long, lonely road stretching out into the night. After what felt like hours, Marcus saw a faint glow in the distance, a small town, its lights cutting through the fog. Relief washed over him. He was finally nearing civilization, a place where he could take a real break and maybe even get a good night's sleep. As he approached the town, he noticed something strange. The lights seemed to flicker, as if they were struggling to stay on. The buildings were dark, their windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. The streets were empty, no signs of life anywhere. Marcus slowed down, his truck rumbling through the silent town. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past midnight. The town should have had some activity, even at this hour, but there was nothing. He pulled up to what looked like a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. The place looked abandoned, the windows dirty and the door slightly ajar. Marcus hesitated for a moment before deciding to investigate. He stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting at his skin. The fog swirled around him as he made his way to the diner, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a darkened interior. "Hello?" Marcus called out, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. He reached for his flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the shadows. The diner was empty, the tables covered in a thin layer of dust. The air was stale, as if the place hadn't been occupied in years. Marcus walked slowly through the diner, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, lurking just out of sight. He reached the counter and noticed a newspaper lying open on one of the stools. The date caught his eye. It was from 10 years ago. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances Plague Town, Last Seen at Rest Stop on Highway 36." Marcus's blood ran cold. The article detailed a series of unexplained disappearances, all of which were linked to the rest stop he had just left. The victims were all truckers or travelers who had stopped there, never to be seen again. The air in the diner grew colder, and Marcus felt a presence behind him. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to shift and move on their own, closing in around him. He backed away slowly, his heart racing. The fog outside the diner's windows thickened, pressing against the glass as if it was trying to get in. Marcus knew he needed to leave. Whatever had haunted the rest stop had followed him here. He rushed out of the diner and back to his truck, slamming the door shut behind him. The engine roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal, speeding out of the town as fast as he could. The fog followed him, clinging to the truck like a living thing. Marcus's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting to the mirrors. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, the town disappearing into the mist behind him. He drove for hours, the fog never letting up, the road never changing. It was as if he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. He began to wonder if he'd ever find his way out, or if he was doomed to drive the endless highway forever. As the first light of dawn broke through the fog, Marcus finally saw the outline of a city in the distance. The fog began to lift, the oppressive weight of the night fading away. He drove into the city, the familiar sights and sounds bringing him some comfort. He pulled into a truck stop on the outskirts, exhausted and shaken. The events of the night played over and over in his mind, the fear still fresh. He knew he'd never be able to forget what had happened, but he also knew he couldn't tell anyone, they'd never believe him. Marcus decided then and there that he'd never stop at a rest stop on Highway 36 again. Whatever haunted that place was real, and it had nearly claimed him. He'd learned his lesson, and he hoped he'd never have to face it again. As he climbed into the sleeper cab and finally closed his eyes, Marcus thought about the truckers who had disappeared and the ghostly figure he'd seen in the mirror. 6. The Haunted Byway. It was just another long stretch of road, a seemingly endless ribbon of asphalt that twisted and turned through the mountains and valleys of rural West Virginia. To most, the road was known simply as Byway 66, an old highway that had long been bypassed by newer, faster routes. But to those who had traveled it in the dead of night, it was known by another name, the Haunted Byway. For years, truckers and travelers alike had shared stories about strange occurrences on the old highway. Some spoke of ghostly apparitions that appeared out of nowhere, only to vanish as quickly as they came. Others told tales of cars that broke down for no apparent reason, their engines stalling as if something unseen had reached out and cut the power. And then there were the stories of people who had disappeared without a trace, their vehicles found abandoned along the roadside with no sign of the occupants. Lena had heard all the stories before, but she didn't believe in ghosts. She was a seasoned trucker, used to long hauls through the night, and she had driven almost every road in the country without incident. But as she approached the turnoff for Highway 66 late one evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this road. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the landscape bathed in darkness. The only light came from the full moon, which cast an eerie glow over the trees that lined the highway. Lena adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white as she steered her rig onto the old byway. The road was narrow, with sharp curves and steep inclines that made it difficult to see what lay ahead. Her radio crackled to life as she rounded a bend, the static fading in and out as if something was interfering with the signal. "You out there, Lena?" a familiar voice called over the airwaves. Lena smiled as she recognized the voice of her fellow trucker and longtime friend, Doug. He was a few miles behind her, making his way along the same route. "I'm here," she replied, her voice steady despite the growing unease she felt. "You still planning to take Highway 66? "Yep, just like old times," Doug replied with a chuckle. "You ever hear the stories about this place?" Lena rolled her eyes. Yeah. Ghosts and ghouls and all that nonsense. You know I don't believe in that stuff." Doug's tone grew more serious. "Maybe not, but there's a reason folks say this road is haunted. I've heard some pretty weird things over the years." Lena shrugged it off. "It's just a road, Doug. Nothing to worry about." But as the words left her mouth, she couldn't help but glance into her rearview mirror. The darkness seemed thicker here, as if the shadows themselves were alive. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts from her mind. She was just tired, that was all. As the miles rolled by, the road grew more treacherous. The curves became sharper, the incline steeper, and the trees seemed to close in around her. The air grew colder, the chill seeping into the cab despite the heater running at full blast. Lena reached for her coffee, hoping the caffeine would keep her alert. But as she lifted the cup to her lips, something caught her eye. A figure stood at the side of the road, barely visible in the moonlight. Lena's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly set the cup down, her eyes fixed on the figure as she approached. It was a woman, dressed in a long, flowing white gown that seemed to shimmer in the pale light. Her hair was dark, cascading down her back in waves, and her face was obscured by shadows. Lena's foot hovered over the brake, but she hesitated, unsure if she should stop. The woman turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting Lena's through the windshield. Lena felt a jolt of fear as she realized the woman's eyes were hollow, empty sockets where her eyes should have been. In a panic, Lena slammed on the brakes, her truck skidding to a halt just feet from the woman. But when Lena looked again, the woman was gone. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the empty road ahead. She could still feel the woman's gaze, those empty eyes boring into her soul. Her hands shook as she gripped the wheel, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She reached for the radio, her fingers fumbling as she tried to call Doug. "Doug, you there? I just saw something, someone." There was no response, only static on the other end. Lena tried again, but the radio remained silent. She cursed under her breath, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she had seen. It had to be a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on her tired mind. But deep down, Lena knew that wasn't true. With a trembling hand, she put the truck back into gear and slowly began to drive again. The road stretched out before her, dark and foreboding, and the trees seemed to close in even tighter. Lena kept her eyes on the road, refusing to look into the mirrors, afraid of what she might see. The miles dragged on, each one more harrowing than the last. The road seemed to twist and turn endlessly, and Lena found herself losing track of time. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on all sides, and the air grew colder with each passing minute. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Lena saw something move. She glanced over, her breath catching in her throat as she saw a shadowy figure dart between the trees. It was too quick to make out any details, but it was there, watching her. Lena's heart raced as she tried to focus on the road, but the figure appeared again, this time closer. It was following her. Lena's hands were slick with sweat as she tightened her grip on the wheel. She pressed down on the accelerator, urging the truck to go faster, but the figure kept pace, darting in and out of the trees with unnatural speed. And then, without warning, the figure darted out onto the road. Lena screamed as she swerved to avoid it, her truck careening off the road and into the trees. The world spun around her, the sound of metal crunching and glass shattering filling her ears. And then, everything went black. When Lena awoke, she was slumped over the steering wheel, her head throbbing with pain. She groaned as she sat up, blinking against the harsh light of the moon. The truck was tilted to one side, the front end crumpled against a tree. She reached up to touch her head and winced as her fingers brushed against a gash above her eyebrow. Blood trickled down her face, but she was alive. Somehow, she had survived. But as she looked around, the reality of her situation sank in. The truck was wrecked, the engine dead, and she was stranded in the middle of nowhere on a road that was said to be haunted. She fumbled for her phone, but it was dead, the screen cracked from the crash. Panic set in as Lena realized she was completely alone. She tried the radio again, but it was useless, the static mocking her with its relentless hiss. She had no choice but to wait for someone to find her, but as the minutes ticked by, the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching out toward her. And then, she heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible over the sound of the wind. It was coming from the trees, a voice calling her name. Lena. Lena's blood ran cold. She looked around, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, closer this time, and Lena felt a chill run down her spine. She had to get out of there, had to find a way off this cursed road. She tried to open the door, but it was jammed shut, the metal twisted from the impact. She pushed and shoved, but it wouldn't budge. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and Lena felt a wave of fear wash over her. And then, she saw it, a figure standing just outside the truck, its face obscured by shadows. Lena froze, her heart pounding in her chest as the figure slowly moved closer. It was the woman from the road, the one with the hollow eyes. Lena wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat as the woman reached out a hand, pressing it against the window. The glass fogged under her touch, the outline of her hand leaving a mark that seemed to burn into Lena's mind. Lena, the woman whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Lena scrambled back, pressing herself against the opposite door, but there was nowhere to go. The woman's face was inches from the glass now, her hollow eyes staring into Lena's soul. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the window cracked, the spiderweb pattern spreading across the surface. Lena screamed, her voice echoing through the night as the woman pushed her face against the broken glass, the sharp edges cutting into her skin without drawing blood. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice a mournful wail. Lena squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face as she prayed for the nightmare to end. She could feel the woman's presence, the cold seeping into the cab as the glass continued to crack and splinter. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The air grew still, the only sound Lena could hear was the rapid pounding of her own heartbeat. Lena slowly opened her eyes, terrified of what she might see. The shattered glass still held its spiderweb pattern, but the woman was gone. The cab was silent, the cold air hanging heavy around her. Lena's breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had she imagined it all? Was it the result of the crash, a hallucination brought on by the shock and fear? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing: she needed to get out of there. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Lena reached for the passenger side door. It creaked open with a groan, and she tumbled out onto the cold ground. The pain from the crash surged through her body, but she forced herself to her feet, leaning heavily against the truck for support. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Lena glanced around, but there was no sign of the woman, or of anyone else for that matter. The road stretched out before her, dark and empty, and the shadows seemed to stretch out infinitely in every direction. Her truck was wrecked, her phone was dead, and she had no idea how far she was from the nearest town. But she couldn't stay here, not with the memory of that ghostly woman still fresh in her mind. Lena started walking, her steps slow and unsteady as she made her way down the road. Her heart pounded in her chest, every shadow seeming to move just out of the corner of her eye. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the fear was real, and it gnawed at her with every step. The minutes turned to hours as Lena trudged along the byway, her mind racing with thoughts of what might be lurking in the darkness. The night was pitch black, the moon obscured by thick clouds, and the road seemed to go on forever. She had no idea how far she had walked, but it felt like miles. And then, in the distance, she saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. Lena's heart leaped with hope. A house, or maybe another vehicle, anything that could offer her some form of safety. She quickened her pace, her tired legs protesting with every step, but she didn't care. She just needed to get to that light. As she drew closer, the light grew brighter, and Lena could make out the outline of a small, dilapidated house just off the side of the road. It looked abandoned, the windows dark and the paint peeling, but the light was real, glowing from a single bulb on the porch. She approached cautiously, her instincts warning her to be careful. The house looked like something out of a horror movie, the kind of place you would expect to be haunted. But Lena didn't have much choice. She needed help, and this was her only option. She climbed the creaking steps to the porch, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The door swung open easily, as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the house was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. The light from the porch barely penetrated the shadows, leaving most of the interior shrouded in darkness. But there was something else, a faint sound, like whispering, coming from deeper within the house. Lena's heart raced as she stepped inside, her eyes straining to see in the gloom. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the empty halls like the voices of the dead. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakably mournful, a chorus of sorrow and despair. She took a few more steps into the house, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The whispers seemed to be coming from all around her now, filling her mind with a sense of dread that made her skin crawl. And then, from out of the darkness, she saw them, figures, barely visible in the dim light, standing silently in the shadows. Their eyes were empty, hollow voids that stared at her without seeing, and their mouths moved the sound of her own ragged breathing. She hesitated for a moment before slowly opening her eyes. The truck's cabin was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the shattered windshield, and the cold, eerie silence enveloped her like a shroud. The woman was gone. Lena blinked, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The broken glass on the passenger side still bore the ghostly imprint of the woman's hand, but the figure herself had vanished into the darkness. Lena's heartbeat slowly began to return to normal, though the fear still clung to her like a second skin. She forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to regain control of her thoughts. She needed to find a way out of this nightmare, to get help before whatever was out there returned. With trembling hands, she tried the door again, and this time, it creaked open with a groan. The cold night air rushed in, and Lena stepped out onto the uneven ground, her legs shaky beneath her. The forest around her was dense, the trees towering overhead like ancient sentinels. The road was barely visible through the undergrowth, a thin ribbon of asphalt winding its way into the shadows. The only light came from the moon, casting everything in an eerie, pale glow. Lena looked up and down the road, hoping against hope that she might see headlights approaching, but there was nothing, just the dark, empty stretch of Highway 66, as desolate as it had been when she first turned onto it. She knew she couldn't stay by the truck. She had to keep moving, find help, or at the very least, get to a place where she could use her phone. But the idea of walking down that road, alone in the dark, filled her with dread. Lena reached back into the cab to grab her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as she started down the road. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Every step she took seemed to echo through the night, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the ghostly woman following her. The road twisted and turned through the trees, the curves becoming more disorienting with each passing minute. Lena's mind raced, her thoughts jumping from one possibility to another. What had she seen? Was it real, or just a figment of her imagination, conjured up by exhaustion and fear? The stories about Highway 66 came flooding back to her, the tales of travelers who had never made it to their destination, of cars found empty and abandoned along the roadside. The ghostly figures, the unexplained disappearances. Could they all be true? Lena shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She needed to focus, to keep moving, to find help. But as she rounded another bend, her flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker before it sputtered out completely, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her as she banged the flashlight against her hand, trying to get it to work again. But the light stayed off, and Lena was left standing in the middle of the road, enveloped by the inky blackness. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to take slow, steady breaths. She couldn't let the fear take over. She had to keep moving, even if she couldn't see the way. But just as she took a step forward, she heard it, a faint, distant sound that sent chills down her spine. It was the sound of footsteps, soft and shuffling, coming from somewhere up ahead. Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and she could just make out a shape moving toward her through the darkness. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his features obscured by the shadows. "Hello," Lena called out, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Can you help me?" The man didn't respond. He just kept walking, his footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing through the stillness of the night. As he drew nearer, Lena could see that he was wearing a dark coat, his hands stuffed into the pockets, his face still hidden in the gloom. "Please, I need help," Lena tried again, taking a cautious step backward as the man continued to approach. But something about him was off. There was a stiffness to his movements, an unnatural rigidity that set Lena's nerves on edge. And then, as he stepped into a patch of moonlight, she saw his face. It was pale, almost ghostly white, with hollow, sunken eyes and a slack, expressionless mouth. His skin was taut, stretched over his bones as if he hadn't eaten in days, and there was something about his gaze that made Lena's blood run cold. The man stopped just a few feet from her, his empty eyes staring straight ahead, as if he didn't even see her. Lena took another step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps, as if he were struggling to breathe. And then, without warning, he turned and started walking again, his footsteps echoing down the road as he disappeared into the darkness. Lena stood frozen, her mind reeling. Who was that man? What was wrong with him? And why hadn't he acknowledged her at all? She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead as she turned and started walking again, faster this time, her pulse racing with every step. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides, and Lena could feel the weight of the unseen eyes watching her. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she saw something up ahead, a faint light, flickering in the distance. Lena's heart leaped with hope as she quickened her pace, her feet pounding against the asphalt as she ran toward the light. It was a small, roadside diner, its neon sign buzzing and flickering as it cast a dim glow over the parking lot. Lena stumbled toward the entrance, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The diner was empty, save for an elderly woman standing behind the counter, wiping down a glass with a dish rag. She looked up as Lena entered, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice gravelly with age. Lena nodded, her hands shaking as she approached the counter. I was in an accident," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "My truck, it crashed. I need help." The woman eyed Lena for a moment before nodding. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to one of the booths. "I'll call for a tow." Lena sank into the booth, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She glanced around the diner, her eyes drawn to the old, faded photographs that lined the walls. They showed scenes from a different time, families smiling for the camera, couples dancing at a roadside stop, a young woman leaning against a car with a cigarette dangling from her lips. But as Lena looked closer, she noticed something strange. The people in the photographs had the same hollow eyes, the same pale, gaunt faces as the man she had seen on the road. And there, in the corner of one of the pictures, was the woman in the white gown, her ghostly figure barely visible behind the others. Lena's blood ran cold as she realized that the people in the photographs weren't alive. They were ghosts, trapped in the diner, forever frozen in time. She jumped up from the booth, her heart racing as she backed away from the walls. "I have to go," she muttered, her voice trembling with fear. The elderly woman behind the counter watched her with a knowing smile. "You're on Byway 66, sweetheart," she said softly. "There's no leaving this place." Lena's mind reeled as she stumbled toward the door, her thoughts a jumbled mess of terror and confusion. She had to get out, had to escape before it was too late. But as she pushed open the door, she found herself standing not outside the diner, but back on the road, the darkness stretching out before her once again. She turned around, but the diner was gone, vanished into thin air as if it had never existed. Lena's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she looked around, trying to find some sign of where she was. But there was nothing, just the empty road, the dark trees, and the oppressive silence of the night. Lena's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She was trapped, caught in some kind of nightmare from which there was no escape. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, she heard it again, the sound of footsteps echoing through the darkness. Lena turned, her flashlight still dead in her hand, and saw the figures emerging from the trees. There were dozens of them, their hollow eyes and pale faces glowing in the moonlight as they shuffled toward her. Lena backed away, her heart pounding in her chest as the figures closed in around her. They were the same people from the photographs in the diner, their faces twisted with sorrow and despair. And then, through the crowd of ghostly figures, Lena saw her, a woman in a white gown, her dark hair flowing like water as she glided toward her. Her empty eyes locked onto Lena's, and she reached out a hand, her fingers cold and clammy as they brushed against Lena's skin. "Help me." The ghostly whisper sent a jolt of fear through Lena's entire body. She recoiled, stumbling backward as the woman in white continued to advance, her outstretched hand hovering in the air like a plea frozen in time. The other figures, spectral and silent, formed a loose circle around her, their eyes empty yet somehow filled with an unspeakable sorrow. Lena's instincts screamed at her to run, to break free from the enclosing ring of spirits and flee into the night, but something rooted her to the spot. The woman's haunting gaze, so full of anguish and desperation, held her captive, as if it conveyed a story too tragic to ignore. Who are you?" Lena stammered, her voice quivering as she forced herself to meet the woman's eyes. The woman's lips moved, but no sound emerged. She seemed to struggle, her face contorting with an agony that transcended death itself. The other spirits drew closer, their presence growing more oppressive by the second. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, her breath quickening as the realization set in that these were the lost souls of Highway 66, victims of the same strange force that now had her in its grip. In that tense silence, the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind, like whispers from the past. Lena felt an overwhelming sense of empathy for these spirits, trapped in a never-ending loop of despair. But her fear was just as potent, urging her to escape before she too became one of them. The woman in white finally managed to speak, her voice barely audible, like the wind rustling through the trees. "We are lost," she breathed. "Trapped, and alone. Forever." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of centuries. Lena's mind raced, trying to comprehend the enormity of the situation. These spirits had been wandering this desolate stretch of road for countless years, bound to it by some unseen force. The stories she had heard about Highway 66 weren't just legends, they were a warning. Lena took a step back, her instincts telling her that she needed to break free, to find a way off this cursed road. But the spirits closed in tighter, their faces etched with the same silent plea, "Help us. Free us." How can I help you?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. She didn't know what she was offering, but the compulsion to do something, anything, was overpowering. The woman in white looked down, as if searching for the right words, but then the ground beneath Lena's feet began to tremble. The vibrations were subtle at first, but they quickly grew stronger, the earth quaking with a malevolent force that sent Lena stumbling to the ground. The spirits around her seemed unaffected by the tremors, their expressions unchanging as they continued to watch her with those hollow, desperate eyes. Lena scrambled to her feet, her body trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline. The ground beneath her was shifting, as if something monstrous was awakening beneath the surface. And then, from the darkness ahead, Lena saw headlights cutting through the night. A car was approaching, its engine roaring like a beast through the stillness. The spirits parted as the vehicle came closer, and Lena felt a surge of hope. Maybe this was her chance, her way out. The car skidded to a stop a few feet away from her, its tires screeching on the asphalt. The driver's door flew open, and a man jumped out, his face wild with panic. "Get in," he shouted, his voice carrying over the din of the engine and the now rumbling earth. "We've got to get out of here." Lena hesitated, her gaze flicking between the man and the spirits that still surrounded her. The woman in white was now just a few feet away, her hands still outstretched, her eyes pleading. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice barely a breath on the wind. "Don't leave us." Lena felt a tear slide down her cheek. The weight of their despair was suffocating, but the primal urge to survive was stronger. She turned and ran to the car, jumping into the passenger seat and slamming the door shut. The man floored the gas pedal, and the car sped off down the road, leaving the spirits and the trembling earth behind. Lena's heart raced as the car barreled down the winding byway, the man's hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Who are you?" Lena managed to ask, her voice shaking as she looked over at him. "Name's Jake," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. You're lucky I found you when I did. This place, it's not safe at night. No kidding, Lena muttered, glancing out the window at the dark, foreboding trees that lined the road. Do you know what's happening? Why those spirits are trapped there? Jake hesitated, his jaw clenched as if debating how much to tell her. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and tense. Highway 66, it's cursed. Has been for as long as anyone can remember. The people who die on this road, they don't move on. They're stuck here, reliving their final moments over and over. No one knows why, and no one's ever figured out how to break the curse. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. But why? Why are they trapped? Jake shook his head. I don't know. Some say it's the road itself, others say it's the land, that something evil happened here long ago, and it's tainted the whole area. All I know is, you don't want to be here after dark. Lena's thoughts raced as she processed what he was saying. The spirits she had seen, they were trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment, unable to find peace. And she had almost become one of them. But, is there any way to free them? Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake glanced at her, his expression grim. There are legends, stories about how the curse might be broken. Some say you have to find the source of the curse and destroy it. Others say you have to help the spirits find closure, help them move on. But no one's ever been able to do it, and most who try end up joining them. Lena swallowed hard, her mind reeling. The idea of helping the spirits, of finding a way to break the curse, was terrifying, but the thought of leaving them to suffer was unbearable. As they sped down the road, Lena made a decision. She couldn't just walk away from this. She had to try and help those trapped souls, even if it meant risking her own life. I want to help them, Lena said firmly, her fear giving way to determination. Jake shot her a surprised look, but then he nodded slowly. It's dangerous, he warned. But if you're serious, I know a place we can start. Lena nodded, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. Let's do it. The car roared down the byway, the spirits and the darkness left behind for now, but not forgotten. Lena knew the road ahead would be treacherous, filled with unknown dangers and the haunting echoes of the past. But she also knew she couldn't turn back. The spirits of Highway 66 were counting on her, and she was determined to see this through to the end. 7. The Midnight Caller. It was a little past midnight when Jenna Evans's phone rang, jolting her awake. She fumbled for her cell on the nightstand, squinting at the bright screen in the darkness of her bedroom. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. She hesitated, her groggy mind debating whether to answer. Finally, curiosity got the better of her. "Hello?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Jenna was about to hang up when she heard a faint sound, like someone breathing, slow and deliberate. A shiver ran down her spine. "Hello?" she repeated, a little louder this time, her heart beginning to race. The breathing continued, steady and unnerving. Jenna's pulse quickened as she sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. She strained to hear something, anything, besides the eerie sound of the breathing, but there was nothing. Then, finally, a voice. It was a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to crawl through the phone and wrap itself around her like a cold, clammy hand. "Do you know what time it is?" The question was simple, mundane even, but something about the way it was asked sent chills down her spine. Jenna glanced at the clock on her nightstand, 12:13 a.m. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you calling me?" There was no response, just more of that slow, deliberate breathing. Jenna felt a growing sense of unease, her fingers tightening around the phone. She didn't recognize the voice, but something about it felt familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. "I'm going to hang up now," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Do you know what time it is?" the voice repeated, more insistent this time. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest. "Yes, it's after midnight. What do you want?" A low, almost guttural laugh echoed through the phone, sending another wave of fear through her. "It's time for you to remember." Jenna's mind raced. Remember? Remember what? Before she could ask, the call abruptly ended, leaving her staring at the dark screen, her heart hammering in her chest. She set the phone down, trying to calm her racing thoughts. It was probably just a prank, she told herself. Some creep who got her number and decided to mess with her. But even as she tried to dismiss it, that voice lingered in her mind, cold and unsettling. After a few minutes of sitting in the darkness, Jenna forced herself to lie back down, pulling the covers up to her chin. She closed her eyes and tried to will herself back to sleep, but every creak and rustle of the house seemed amplified, setting her nerves on edge. The memory of that strange voice kept playing over in her mind, making it impossible to relax. She eventually drifted off into an uneasy sleep, only to be awakened again by her phone ringing. The clock now read 2:02 a.m., and the same unknown number was flashing on the screen. Jenna's hand shook as she picked up the phone, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello?" she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. The same low, gravelly voice responded, as if it had been waiting for her. "Do you know what time it is?" Fear gripped her heart like a vice. "Who are you? What do you want?" she asked, her voice breaking. There was a long pause, filled only by that unnerving breathing. Then, the voice whispered, "It's time for you to remember what you did." Jenna's blood ran cold. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the caller's words, but no answers came. She hadn't done anything, at least, nothing that should have brought this upon her. What was this person talking about? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaky. "Please, stop calling me." But the voice only laughed, a sound that was more like a rasping cough than anything else. "You can't run from it. You can't hide from the truth, Jenna." Her stomach twisted in knots. How did they know her name? Panic surged through her, and she ended the call, tossing the phone aside as if it had burned her. She buried her face in her hands, her mind reeling. The darkness around her seemed to close in, pressing against her from all sides. She felt like she was suffocating, drowning in a sea of fear and confusion. Whoever this was, they were toying with her, playing some twisted game. But why? And what did they mean by, "Remember what you did"? Sleep was impossible after that. Jenna sat up in bed, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the puzzle. She considered calling the police, but what would she tell them? That she was receiving creepy phone calls from an unknown number. It seemed so insignificant compared to the terror she was feeling. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As the first light of dawn crept through her bedroom window, Jenna finally allowed herself to relax a little. The daylight brought a sense of safety, a reprieve from the terror of the night. She decided to go about her day as normally as possible, trying to put the night's events out of her mind. She went to work, made small talk with her coworkers, and tried to focus on her tasks. But the fear lingered in the back of her mind, a constant, gnawing presence. As the day wore on, she found herself jumping at every sound, her nerves frayed and her anxiety mounting. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the strange caller was somehow still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. When she got home that evening, the sight of her empty house filled her with dread. The silence was oppressive, the shadows long and menacing. She kept the lights on, every room brightly lit as if that could somehow ward off the darkness that seemed to be closing in on her. She decided to go to bed early, hoping that sleep would provide some escape from the nightmare her life had become. But as she lay there in the dark, her mind wouldn't quiet. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, sent her heart racing. She kept her phone by her side, dreading the thought of it ringing again, but unable to ignore the possibility. She lay there for what felt like hours, her mind a swirling storm of fear and anxiety. Finally, she drifted off into a restless sleep, only to be jarred awake by the shrill ring of her phone. She bolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest as she stared at the screen. It was the same unknown number. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone, her voice barely a whisper as she answered. "Hello." The voice on the other end was more menacing now, almost a growl. "Do you know what time it is?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "Please, just leave me alone," she pleaded, her voice shaking. But the voice only grew colder. "It's time to pay for your sins." Jenna's breath caught in her throat. "I haven't done anything," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I don't know what you want from me." "You know," the voice hissed. "Deep down, you know what you've done. You can't hide from it." Jenna's mind raced, searching for some explanation, but she couldn't find one. She was just an ordinary person, she hadn't committed any crimes, hadn't done anything to deserve this torment. The voice continued, relentless. "You can't escape your past, Jenna. It will always find you. And when it does, it will consume you." She was sobbing now, the fear and confusion overwhelming her. "Please, just stop," she begged. The line went silent for a moment, and Jenna held her breath, praying that the call was over. But then the voice spoke again, softer this time, almost a whisper. "You can't run forever. The truth will come out, and when it does, you'll wish you had never answered the call." The line went dead, leaving Jenna sitting in the darkness, her tears falling onto the bed. She felt completely and utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. For the next few days, Jenna lived in a state of constant fear. Every ring of the phone, every unknown number, sent her heart racing. She stopped answering calls altogether, too terrified of what she might hear. She even considered changing her number, but some deep, nagging fear told her that it wouldn't make a difference. This thing, whatever it was, would find her no matter what. Her nights were the worst. The darkness felt oppressive, suffocating. She barely slept, and when she did, her dreams were filled with the same low, gravelly voice, whispering threats and accusations that chilled her to the bone. As the days turned into a week, Jenna's nerves were completely shot. She barely left the house, jumping at every sound, every shadow. The fear consumed her, taking over her life. And then, one night, the phone rang again. Jenna stared at the screen, her breath hitching in her throat. The same unknown number, the same knot of dread in her stomach. Her hands shook as she picked up the phone, the fear almost paralyzing her. But this time, she didn't answer. She let it ring, the sound echoing through the silent house like a death knell. Jenna watched the phone ring with a sense of mounting dread. The familiar, cold voice from the past week echoed in her mind, sending shivers down her spine. She knew she had to answer, if only to confront whatever this nightmare was once and for all. But she hesitated, her fear of what might come next almost overwhelming. After the call had rung for several moments, it finally stopped. Jenna's breath was shallow, her heart pounding as she tried to calm herself. She waited, counting the seconds, hoping that the silence meant it was over. But her relief was short-lived. The phone buzzed again, signaling a voicemail. With trembling hands, Jenna dialed into her voicemail, the process seeming to stretch on for an eternity. The voice message began, and her heart sank as she recognized the same gravelly tone she had come to dread. Jenna, the voice began, the name dripping with an unsettling familiarity. You cannot hide from the truth forever. It's only a matter of time before you face it. It is closer than you think. The voicemail ended, and Jenna sat in stunned silence, the implications of the message crashing over her. The terror she had been living with felt more palpable than ever. She glanced around her dimly lit room, the shadows seeming to grow darker, more menacing. Unable to bear the isolation and the creeping sense of dread, Jenna decided she needed to take action. She reached out to the police, explaining the situation as best as she could. The officer on the other end listened patiently but expressed skepticism. I understand this is unsettling, Miss Evans, but without more information, it's difficult for us to act. If you feel threatened, you might consider staying with friends or family until this is resolved. Jenna agreed to the officer's suggestion, feeling a slight sense of relief. She packed a small bag, her mind racing with thoughts of what might be waiting for her if she stayed. She decided to stay with her older brother, Tom, who lived in a neighboring town. When she arrived at Tom's house, he welcomed her with a mix of concern and confusion. After explaining the situation as best she could, Tom reassured her and promised to help keep her safe. That night, as Jenna lay in the guest room, the eerie feeling of being watched persisted. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside seemed amplified. Tom had installed extra security measures and stayed up late, but Jenna's anxiety was not so easily assuaged. Around 3 a.m., she was jolted awake by the sound of her phone ringing once more. She leaped out of bed and grabbed the phone from the bedside table, her heart racing. It was another unknown number. Tom, hearing the commotion, rushed into the room. "Are you okay?" he asked, his face etched with concern. Jenna nodded, holding the phone tightly in her hand. "I have to answer it," she said, her voice shaking. Tom stood by her side, a protective presence as Jenna took a deep breath and answered the call. The voice on the other end was as chilling as ever, its gravelly tone sending shivers down her spine. "Jenna," it said, the name pronounced with a menacing edge. "You thought you could escape, didn't you? The truth is still waiting for you." Jenna's hands shook as she tried to keep her voice steady. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" The voice responded, low and deliberate. "You can't run from your past, Jenna. The sins you've buried will come to light. It's only a matter of time." Before Jenna could respond, the call ended abruptly. She stared at the phone, her mind reeling. Tom took the phone from her, his face pale. "This is getting serious," he said, his voice firm. "We need to find out who this is and why they're targeting you." The next day, Jenna and Tom visited the local police station, hoping for more assistance. They provided the officers with recordings of the calls and the details of the voicemails. The police agreed to investigate further but emphasized that their resources were limited, especially with the vague nature of the threats. Feeling a growing sense of helplessness, Jenna returned to Tom's house. They decided to go through her personal records and contacts, trying to figure out if there was any clue to why she might be targeted. They scoured through old emails, social media accounts, and even contacted friends and acquaintances, but found nothing that could explain the mysterious calls. As days turned into weeks, the calls continued, each one more insidious than the last. The voice grew more demanding, more taunting, as if it took pleasure in Jenna's mounting anxiety. The messages became increasingly cryptic, speaking of past deeds and hidden truths Jenna couldn't recall. Despite their best efforts, Jenna and Tom couldn't uncover any concrete information about who was behind the calls. They even considered hiring a private investigator, but the cost and uncertainty were daunting. One night, as Jenna was trying to relax in the living room, Tom came in with a stack of old family photos he had found in the attic. He hoped that reviewing them might spark some memory or clue. Jenna sat beside him, flipping through the faded photographs of family gatherings and vacations. As they went through the photos, Jenna stumbled upon an old picture of herself with a group of friends from high school. One of the faces looked vaguely familiar but unsettling. A sense of déjà vu washed over her, but she couldn't place it. Tom noticed her reaction and leaned in. "Do you recognize anyone in that photo?" Jenna nodded slowly, her brow furrowing. "I think so. This person, it's like I know them, but I can't remember why." Tom examined the photo closely and then his face turned pale. "Wait a minute. I remember seeing that person's name on one of your social media accounts, someone you were friends with years ago." Jenna's eyes widened. "Do you think they could be involved?" Tom nodded. "It's possible. We need to look into this person and see if they're connected to the calls." They immediately began searching for information about the person in the photo. They discovered that the individual had a history of disturbing behavior and had been involved in several online disputes with Jenna years earlier. The more they uncovered, the more it seemed like this person might be the source of the torment. Feeling a renewed sense of purpose, Jenna and Tom decided to confront this individual. They gathered all the evidence they had collected and went to the police with their findings. The officers agreed to follow up and issued a warrant for the person's arrest. In the weeks that followed, the mysterious calls finally stopped. Jenna felt a sense of relief, but the experience had left her deeply shaken. She realized that the terror she had endured was not just about the calls but about facing the hidden fears and unresolved issues from her past. Jenna gradually began to rebuild her life, finding comfort in the support of her family and friends. The haunting calls became a dark memory, a reminder of how the past could come back to haunt the present. Though the calls ceased, Jenna knew she would carry the impact of the experience with her for a long time to come. Thanks for watching.